I stand by my decisions as special counsel, including the decision to bring charges against President Trump. Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in criminal activity. If asked whether to prosecute a former president based on the same facts today, I would do so regardless of whether that president was a Democrat or a Republican. No one should be above the law in this country, and the law required that he be held to account, so that is what I did.
Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. This show, Deadline White House, debuted the day that Donald Trump fired Jim Comey. He fired him for refusing to look the other way in the Mike Flynn case, among other actions that Donald Trump viewed as annoying and disloyal. Since that first broadcast, we have endeavored to chronicle Donald Trump's vicious war against the rule of law in our country. And no one understands what Trump's attacks against the rule of law look like better than that man, former special counsel Jack Smith. So much of what we know about Donald Trump's efforts to undo his defeat in the 2020 presidential election against Joe Biden and his mishandling of some of the country's most sensitive national security secrets is because of the tireless work of Jack Smith and his team. More than anyone else in the country, he represented a threat to Donald Trump because he followed the facts and they led him deep inside Donald Trump's government and political coalition. The facts revealed crimes, and those crimes were serious enough to represent a very real risk of conviction at trial for Donald Trump. That's the standard to indict somebody. And because of that fact, Donald Trump has called Jack Smith horrible things, a, quote, thug, a scoundrel, a criminal, and a sick man. And we could actually go on, but we don't want to waste our time that way. Trump has threatened to prosecute him, and Jack Smith has made clear that he was just doing his job. He would do it all over again if given the chance. In his letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland, delivering his final report, he writes this, quote, the claim from Mr. Trump that my decisions as a prosecutor were influenced or directed by the Biden administration or other political actors is, in a word, laughable. While we were not able to bring the cases we charged to trial, I believe the fact that our team stood up for the rule of law matters. I believe the example our team set for others to fight for justice without regard for the personal costs matters. The facts, as we uncovered them in our investigation and as we set forth in my report, matter. That's where we start the hour. Joining us for his first interview, former special counsel Jack Smith. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
I asked you this when you walked in, and I'll ask you, how weird is it to view it as part of your service to tell the story of the investigations you led?
Yeah, well, you know, I was a career prosecutor. I worked in the Justice Department and other prosecutors' offices for near on 30 years. And I don't know if your viewers know this, but I worked in Republican and Democratic administrations over and over. I was the acting U.S. attorney in the first Trump administration in Nashville, Tennessee. And that administration appointed me to a position running a war crimes tribunal for the State Department. So I have investigated cases focusing on the facts and the law throughout my career. We did this case the same way, under the same standards. And, you know, the thing that's, I think, important for your viewers to know is those standards are not meant to change from one administration to the next. And in my experience, until now, they haven't. And so, you know, I think we are facing an attack on the rule of law that is different in kind and scope to anything I've seen in my lifetime. And one of the reasons I wanted to be with you here today in advance of the 4th of July, celebrating the birth of a country that we all love, is to celebrate the public servants who do this work, the people I spent my career working shoulder to shoulder with. I loved being a prosecutor, and part of it was I loved being around these sort of people. And it angers me to see them victimized, to see them demonized for doing their jobs. I think it's really important that we stand up for them and let them know that there are a lot of people out there who back them and who are with them. And that's not just the people who've been targeted and fired for no reason for doing their jobs. It's also the people still in the Justice Department today. There are a lot of good career prosecutors who right now are working under incredibly difficult circumstances, and they're still trying to do the right thing. And these are not self-promoters. These are not people who are going to go out and, crow about their achievements. We need to hold them up and celebrate them because they're part of what makes this country great.
Some of the agents, FBI agents that worked for you have been savaged by Donald Trump and Kash Patel. At least one agent talked about being fired while he was taking care of his very, very sick wife. What did you expect to happen to these agents, and do you regret putting any of them in that position?
I feel terrible about what has happened to them. If there's one thing I've spent my time on since leaving my work as special counsel, is doing what I can to help and support them. The individual you're talking about, he was nursing his wife who was dying of cancer, and they fired him shortly after she died. I went to the funeral. That funeral was filled with heroes, public servants on both families. And I just can't believe that if people knew the character of these people I worked with, that they could ever stand for the demonizing that's happened to them. It's just beyond anything I can understand.
And my sense from my limited exposure to people in DOJ and the FBI from my time in government is they don't really want to go do other things. They want this to be their life's work, protecting the country's national security. Will you talk a little bit about the price people have paid who have been purged for political purposes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the agents and prosecutors I've worked with, and to be clear, not just in the special counsel's office, but throughout my career in a bunch of different positions I've had in the Justice Department, this is the culmination of what they wanted to do. It's why they went to law school, and it's their way of serving our country. And we've seen so many times in these retribution cases where prosecutors wouldn't be a part of it. Prosecutors in Minnesota who are like, I'm not going to investigate the family member of a shooting victim. I'm not doing that. Prosecutors who wouldn't go through with retribution prosecutions. And those people give up a lot. This is their whole career. A lot of them, this isn't a lucrative sort of profession for a lawyer in terms of what you could do in private practice. They have to support their families. And one thing I have hope about is I think the traditions in the department, the people it draws, are so strong that we're going to have to rehabilitate the department for sure. But there's a lot of people still there, still in place, wanting to do the right thing, wanting to follow the facts and the law, not be a part of any retribution campaign. And I think, for me, one of the things I see as I go around and talk to folks, and I try to travel around the country a lot and see different people and talk to different perspectives about this, is that those people, it really matters to them if they know they're being supported. Part of this campaign is to make people feel like isolated and feel like they don't have people backing them up. And so I just think it's really important. I want to express my support. I think everybody else should express their support. It's something with meaning, and it's also something that matters.
I mean, Chris Wray was the director of the FBI when the FBI agents that you're talking about went to work for you. He said nothing. Why?
I can't really comment on other people's choices. I would say...
Would it help?
Well, I think my perspective on this is that in the moment we're in, which is a pretty dire moment, right, what we're facing, that we should be uplifting the people who are doing the right thing. And, I'll give you an example from my life. I resigned as special counsel. I know I need to get a lawyer because the president has said he wants to jail me for doing my job. And so I retain lawyers, Covington and Burling. As soon as that becomes public, the president and the Justice Department target that law firm. And they do it because they don't want me to have counsel. They don't want to have anyone represent me. And what happened next was the very day that happened, Nicole, the lawyers at the firm called me up and said, Jack, don't worry about it. We're there for you. They did not blink for a second. And as you know, that's very different than how some other law firms behaved. I think we should focus on things like that and separating a firm like Covington and Burling from other ones that didn't show courage to come forward.
Well, right. The ones that fought also have batted 1,000 in the courts. I think Judge Beryl Howell described those executive orders as giving her chills, chilling her to the bone. But some of the giant law firms that were so central in our politics in the first Trump term didn't just capitulate to Trump. They're now working for Trump's Justice Department, firms like Paul Weiss and others. What do you make of the damage they're doing to our democracy at a moment you describe as dire?
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems, there's several layers, right? One of the problems right today besides the retribution prosecutions, is that the Justice Department can't do its job, right? If you go to court...
Explain that.
Well, if you go to court and the judges don't trust you, you can't do the basic things that you need to do to represent the American people in court. And we have seen judges across the country say they can't trust prosecutors anymore. And that has such a cascading effect on any sort of case. And, you know, I can't count how many opinions, but one opinion like that in my career would have been seismic. People would not know what to do if a court said, you know, trust that's been built over generations has been lost in days, right? And that's happening every day. And so regardless of what you think politically, they're just not effective at doing their job anymore. They've jettisoned expertise, right? And so we have a situation where we've got rid of people who know how to protect our national security, and we think that that's somehow not going to have an effect on our national security. You know, an example I can give you, Brian Driscoll. I don't know if you know who he is. He was the...
He made a great video at the beginning to kind of rally the troops, it seemed, from the outside.
Yeah, I mean, he's a folk hero in the FBI. If you were casting for a hero, that's what they look
Central
like,
casting,
right?
Yes.
And just for your viewers, this is a guy, career agent, you know, mob investigator, SWAT team, hostage rescue, served overseas, Medal of Valor, bravery medals, all these things, and an expert in counterintelligence. They got rid of him because he stood up for agents who were being targeted improperly. You can't tell me, you cannot tell me our country is as safe as it was when people like that are being let go and fired for no reason.
I have some questions, but I wanted to give you a chance, because you've been busy interviewing, to share with your audience, with our whole MS Now audience, any of your top line or first takeaways. And then I have a question for you as well.
Well, I'm just so struck by how decency and integrity and facts and apolitical sort of careers don't screech, right? And so much of what we're oriented to cover is that which is shrieking, right? They're shrieking by arresting tourists at the reflecting pool, or shrieking by diverting intelligence agents from the FBI to some crackpot case in Georgia, or shrieking because someone is covered concerning conduct by the director of the FBI. And instead, like, what integrity sounds like is something a lot more methodical and calm and by the book. And I think that when we get to meet the people that we've covered, I was deathly nervous. I reread every piece of paper we ever had. But the thing about public servants is, like, there's not some, you know, they don't hide the secret side. It's not a diversion. And I thought about how much Trump has sort of broken my brain. You know, I'm sitting here trying to figure out what he hid and what he didn't tell us. And a lot of what we talked about were the kinds of things that you and I covered from the filings and the things that were public facing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I have a couple questions. The first was thinking about who we're listening to. And as I mentioned, he obviously trusts you and thinks of you as someone that he can have a factual dialogue with about the health of our civic life and our democracy and our rule of law. And again, I think that's striking. And it's not a surprise to those of us who work with you, but it bears noting, even if we are also colleagues. And in doing that, he was issuing, yeah, sure. He was issuing the warning. I mean, if Bob Mueller was the Elliot Ness of his time, Jack Smith is the Bob Mueller of our time. And he had nothing but, you know, kind words of respect for how Mueller lived his life and career and integrity. And so when we listen to what I'm calling the Mueller of our time today, Bob Mueller has passed, and he tells you tonight that we are facing this attack on the rule of law that is different. That this is not, sometimes there are crimes and sometimes there are people in office who have been caught committing crimes in both parties, as he was careful to note. But this is something different. We have just that short bit. I don't know if it jumped out to you in the moment, but let's listen to that for your response.
I think we are facing an attack on the rule of law that is different in kind and scope to anything I've seen in my lifetime.
What does that mean to you, that he wants us to know that?
Well, look, in some ways, there's so much gaslighting in our politics. And there's so much sort of a attempt to intimidate people covering the facts as we see them with our own eyes, that it was reassuring that he sees what we see and what we cover, and that from his extraordinarily high perch inside the department and with all of his years of experience, he views it as dire as I do. It was, I would say, equally striking that when I asked him, if you were looking at our country and just assessing it in terms of whether the rule of law were alive or dead, is it still alive? He said, absolutely. I mean, that he knows of sort of more pockets, I guess, the things that aren't in the headlines inside the department that are still, and he said, they're not throwing sand in the gear. They're not part of the resistance. They're just in there doing their job. But then he did say, I said, but what if doing their job, ran afoul of Mr. Blanche or others? And he said, yeah, well, that would be the fork in the road. I mean, what was interesting to me is that it is both as bad as it looks from the outside, that weaponization is the central organizational theory for the Department of Justice, that the examples that he lifted up were Danielle Sassoon, that's who he was talking about there at the end, who left over the perfectly predicated case against Eric Adams, the folks who have, left before bringing the cases against Jim Comey, Eric Siebert, and others, the people in Minnesota he mentioned who refused to investigate family members of a shooting victim. What is, I think, still... I think the work for people like us is to do what he's talking about, to lift up the people who are sort of paying the price of their life's work, of people who grow up and want to do this work are some of the very ones who rose to the top. And those ones at the top were the ones that worked on his cases. So I think I had a greater appreciation for the loss of experience, the loss of the cream of the crop, right? The people that have been purged were not necessarily the first agents in. They were the best of the best, the ones who understood the sensitive nature of the cases against Donald Trump, the ones who had enough clearances to even work on the Mar-a-Lago documents case. He couldn't say anything about that one, and didn't bite when I asked him if he thought Aileen Cannon would be nominated to the Supreme Court. But I think it was both reassuring that he sees the direness of the moment, the way you and I think largely cover it. And it was ominous to think about all the experience that's been axed for political purpose from the Bureau and the department.
Yeah, and when you take out the experts, the tough people, the folks with multi-decade experience in catching the bad folks, then wholly separate from the rule of law issues, which we care so much about, you also make the country less safe, quite literally so. I have one more question for you, then I'll let you go. I'm kind of Lawrencing your Rachel right now.
We can do this anytime. I'm always available.
In lyrics, the famous lyric is, "Please, Lord, don't let me be misunderstood." And I felt through him, and I'm curious your take, that like Mueller before him and like folks who were using the integrity, quiet rule book, and we understand why in normal times that has been the norm, that he referred back repeatedly, even when it wasn't in your question, to communicating, to reaching people with the facts, and making people understand these cases. And I wonder, because you were a communicator in your own right, and here we are in media, so that's part of what we do is look at the stories, define them, try to tell them. What it says about, you said broke your brain, well, whether a reality show propagandist has broke some of the communication and storytelling in our country, where my view, and I'm curious yours, I think he's basically right in his theory of the case, that if you don't communicate in real time with the way people are getting information on their phones, et cetera, today, you're at a disadvantage. And yet Absolutely. I also thought it's too bad that people doing the substantive work, not to diminish the communication we all do, but the people doing substantive work, like I don't want my doctor or my beat cop prosecutor thinking too much about the press release when they need to do the job. I give you the final word on that tonight.
So I thought about Tim Snyder when we had this part of the conversation, who, wrote on tyranny, writes about autocracy. And I thought about how you don't need to overwhelm people by making everyone think that we all have to do everything, right? We all have to do our thing. And what I thought was interesting is He has what every veteran of the Department of Justice has for Robert Mueller, and that's reverence, full stop. And he's making some different choices. So he didn't say that he learned, and he said to me it wasn't on my mind at all. It is also true that in one news cycle, Donald Trump and Bill Barr destroyed 23 months of Robert Mueller's meticulous, respectful deference to the prerogatives of Donald Trump when he was interviewing him. And Jack Smith has made a lot of the same choices, but a few different choices. And I think that's really interesting in its own right.
And he tells you tonight that we are facing this attack on the rule of law that is different. That this is not, sometimes there are crimes and sometimes there are people in office who have been caught committing crimes in both parties, as he was careful to note. But this is something different. We have just that short bit. I don't know if it jumped out to you in the moment, but let's listen to that for your response.
I think we are facing an attack on the rule of law that is different in kind and scope to anything I've seen in my lifetime.
What does that mean to you, that he wants us to know that?
Well, look, in some ways, there's so much gaslighting in our politics, and there's so much sort of a attempt to intimidate people covering the facts as we see them with our own eyes, that it was reassuring that he sees what we see and what we cover, and that from his extraordinarily high perch inside the department and with all of his years of experience, he views it as dire as I do. It was, I would say, equally striking that when I asked him, if you were looking at our country and just assessing it in terms of whether the rule of law were alive or dead, is it still alive? He said, absolutely. I mean, that he knows of sort of more pockets, I guess, the things that aren't in the headlines inside the department that are still, and he said, they're not throwing sand in the gear. They're not part of the resistance. They're just in there doing their job. But then he did say, I said, but what if doing their job, ran afoul of Mr. Blanche or others? And he said, yeah, well, that would be the fork in the road. I mean, what was interesting to me is that it is both as bad as it looks from the outside, that weaponization is the central organizational theory for the Department of Justice, that the examples that he lifted up were Danielle Sassoon, that's who he was talking about there at the end, who left over the perfectly predicated case against Eric Adams, the folks who have, left before bringing the cases against Jim Comey, Eric Siebert, and others, the people in Minnesota he mentioned who refused to investigate family members of a shooting victim. What is, I think, still, I think the work for people like us is to do what he's talking about, to lift up the people who are sort of paying the price of their life's work, of people who grow up and want to do this work are some of the very ones who rose to the top. And those ones at the top were the ones that worked on his cases. So I think I had a greater appreciation for the loss of experience, the loss of the cream of the crop, right? The people that have been purged were not necessarily the first agents in. They were the best of the best, the ones who understood the sensitive nature of the cases against Donald Trump, the ones who had enough clearances to even work on the Mar-a-Lago documents case. He couldn't say anything about that one, and didn't bite when I asked him if he thought Aileen Cannon would be nominated to the Supreme Court. But I think it was both reassuring that he sees the direness of the moment, the way you and I think largely cover it. And it was ominous to think about all the experience that's been axed for political purpose from the Bureau and the department.
For the first time, the first prosecutor to ever indict a president, Jack Smith, who ultimately did it twice because he said the evidence supported it, speaking out in his first journalistic interview, including about those controversial January 6 pardons.
What do you say about the facts that you developed that you see? I know you don't watch a ton of news, but you see enough to know that the basic principle of recidivism likely applies to the election case. The things that you charged are a lot of the same kinds of stories we cover. What is the cost of someone not being held accountable for their crimes?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about the pardons of these people convicted for the violence on January 6th, right? There's all sorts of costs. There's the obvious cost of just recidivism. These are people who committed their crimes in the name and in the interest of Donald Trump, and he's returned the favor, right, by pardoning them. That sends one message to them. A message I'm equally concerned about is the message that it sends to law enforcement. Supporting law enforcement should not be a political issue.
Jack Smith speaking forthrightly there on 2 points. The second, as you heard, is that Donald Trump sided with violent criminals over police, that he is an anti-police president. The pardon is a power that the president constitutionally has. No one is saying that it was itself illegal. Smith is saying, however, that it is anti-police, anti-law enforcement. The first point he made was admittedly a little more legalistic. He referred to recidivism. What he's saying in plain English is, if you let people get away with it, they'll do it again. And that maybe Donald Trump wants to do it again, to have another violent insurrection or other violent crime committed on his behalf. Recidivism is why you have strong penalties and deterrence under the law, something that prosecutors like Smith basically devote their lives to. And he's saying, for the first time in the modern era, it's the president undercutting that on behalf of criminals. He also spoke about the midterms.
I'm very concerned of what's going to happen in the next election, absolutely.
Do you see, again, in things that are covered and things that are public-facing, conduct ahead of the midterms that you investigated on in the January 6th case?
Well, I've been thinking about it more in terms of what needs to be done based on what we saw happen last time. And, it's a different situation now based on, the people who perpetrated January 6th have probably learned from how they did that. My personal view is I think the state attorney generals have a tremendous role to play here. They can make sure the rule of law functions in their state. And I would also say that I think a thing that all of us can do is support election workers and election officials. The last time around, we saw that those people stood firm, and they were, in many cases, the difference. It's clear to me, anyways, that where I've seen publicly that those people are going to be put under great pressure. And my experience, not only just the special counsel, but, I was the chief of the public integrity section at the Department of Justice for 5 years, had a number of cases with election officials. These are people also, they're not tooting their own horn. They're not self-promoters. They just care about our democracy. We need to show them that we have their back.
Smith speaking out clearly there in this new MS Now exclusive interview. When he mentions the public integrity section, which has been, of course, completely decimated under Donald Trump, that's the part of the DOJ that deals with the important but sensitive cases of anti-corruption and potentially indicting or prosecuting lawmakers, politically connected individuals, important politicians. To run that section, you have to have kind of the gold standard of being evidence-based, nonpartisan, and having integrity. It's kind of the fulcrum of pressure inside the DOJ. And when he was there, for example, he pursued famously a case against Democrat John Edwards because he said the evidence supported it. And ultimately, as we know, concluded that there was enough evidence to go after Donald Trump. I mentioned a case of a Democrat and a Republican. So when Smith then now draws on that credibility and his entire career to assess the so-called enemies list or some of the cases that the Trump DOJ has brought on his personal demand, it comes with great credibility. Most people may only know Smith from prosecuting Trump, and that might even overweight how you look at him. But he is kind of, like I'm telling you, the legal gold standard for these cases. So when he says, as we just learned he did, I'm going to play you the excerpt, that so many of them lack any merit, that is kind of the ultimate slam dunk against some of the Trump DOJ's revenge cases. Take a look.
I, from my perspective, have seen a number of cases. James Comey, Letitia James, Jerome Powell, right? There's not criminality here. Seashells. So the only reasonable explanation is the president has it out for these people, and he has people who are his former personal lawyers who are going to do what he says, regardless of the factual law.
Going after people regardless of the law will get you a lot of trouble in court, might get your case tossed. And if some of those folks are doing it knowingly, below the legal standard of what it takes to indict someone, they could be disbarred or worse. Jack Smith, again, the expert on that. So that's not nothing. And for those who say, well, when is it going to matter? Well, it could matter very soon if Congress changes hands, and it could matter a lot in just over 2 years if the White House and DOJ changes hands. He's sort of telling you how it is tonight. Now, I want to just remind everyone, we are here in an extraordinary place. A few years ago, it would have been unthinkable that a prosecutor would be on television talking about not one but two federal cases against a former president. It had never happened before. So let's remember how we got here, because what started out with lawsuits turned ultimately into the insurrection in the 2020 plots. Some of them we've marked for you green or yellow because they were effectively legally allowed. But as Trump got more desperate and those things didn't work, when you get to the Congress overturning votes, the requests on Pence, the aborted plan to have a military plot or coup, and then ultimately the final arrow we all know, the illegal sabotage of January 6th, those were the plots that accrued. And Smith ultimately was tapped as one of these special counsels with extra independence to pursue them. And as you know, I'll remind you, as we plotted this, he indicted many of them and won convictions against, we saw at the state level, over the overlapping plots. The federal cases, of course, were truncated by the Supreme Court.
We have two fellows who are also not intimidated, and I really want to get both of your reactions to what you heard there and how this conversation is now getting framed by Jack Smith. You first, Michael.
Yeah, I think what he did this afternoon on Nicole Wallace's show was incredibly important. The Justice Department, for our careers at least, and for many generations before that, would always say within its own hallways, we speak through indictments, we speak through official documents. We're not proselytizers of our theories, we're not holding a lot of press conferences. And at a time where norms were respected by both political polls and everything in between, that made a lot of sense. I very much hope we get back to that world. But we're lying to ourselves if we pretend that we are in a normal time now. The ideals that the Justice Department has always stood for, the concept of justice itself, the moral imperative from which the department takes its name, is not functioning as it is supposed to. There is, quite frankly, a cancer in the RFK building right now. I think we can stop it. I think we can cut it out eventually. But what is happening in those hallways, what is happening on the 7th floor, is not normal. And it requires a response to meet the exigencies of this moment. And I'm glad he's stepping up and making that response.
I just add two things. I think there's two reasons why it's really helpful for Jack Smith specifically to be talking right now. One is, as time passes, the indictments that he brought and why they were brought grow more and more distant. And what I'm worried about is as we get further and further away from January 6th and the insurrection, we run the risk of creating a false equivalency. That it's like, okay, maybe Donald Trump's doing something kind of political with these prosecutions, but he got prosecuted too. And so, Jack Smith is an embodiment of why Donald Trump was righteously prosecuted for fomenting an insurrection and try to overturn a Democratic election, and then stealing confidential information, and at least there was some public reporting suggesting that he might have been trying to sell that information. So I think it's really important for him as a person to be speaking out and making sure that history doesn't get forgotten. The second thing that I think is important here is, you made the point about how well respected Jack Smith is here. I think his presence outside of the Department of Justice is going to give a little bit of courage to folks inside the Department of Justice, the career folks, to leave. We were talking about this earlier. I say it every time. The only thing the Department of Justice has is its credibility, its ability to convince judges and juries of things. And the problem that I see right now is you've got career prosecutors who, for very understandable reasons, for moral reasons, are trying to stay in RFK, stay in the building. I think that's a mistake. They're lending their credibility to an institution that doesn't deserve it right now. People like Jack Smith show that there is a future for them outside of that institution.
It's interesting because he spoke to that. He spoke to the idea of earning trust. Let's play that tape if we can.
I think if you have a question of, is a rioter who assaulted a police officer on January 6th a patriot, or is Harry Dunn a patriot? We win that argument every time if people have the facts. I think we've now learned that you got to be able to get people to understand the facts. We've got a great product in the work that we did as a special counsel, the work the Justice Department does every day. But the people who do it, who are really the reason you can trust it, they don't promote themselves. And so we need to get their stories out there. I think if that happens, the sort of trust in government, which is pretty hard to earn, you can do that.
Brendan, we have a great product out there. It's just not seen because, in the narcissistic world that we live in, these people are too diligent and they aren't self-promoters. But maybe that has to change in order for people to really get the facts and understand the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, I think there's the cultural aspect of not wanting to speak out and wanting to speak through indictments. So, I hope that Jack Smith sort of changes his attitude on that and starts speaking out more. I also think, bluntly, there's a money aspect to this, which is, there is an enormous amount of money and political power being used to try to rewrite the history of January 6th and the elections. I remember after Trump got reelected, I was talking with any number of people about, folks wanted to create a museum to January 6th and things like that. It didn't come together because the money wasn't there, So there's a huge imbalance, which just makes it even more important for folks like him to be speaking out.
Can I just get you to also, I'll just throw this on the table, as Michael Steele was saying, you take it wherever you want to go. He also acknowledged that the assault on our elections is alive and well right now. And he instructed state attorney generals to hold the line, to think about what it is that they will do when they are confronted with this. He talked about the election workers that held firm the last time Donald Trump tried this. To be very clear, he tried it in 2020, as you all well know, and noted that they were the ones that, frankly, that made the difference, the people at the state level. I think when folks hear people like me say, I think Donald Trump is trying to steal the election and these are the ways in which they're trying to do it, they think I'm being dramatic and hyperbolic. But you just heard Jack Smith lay it out in a way that I hope folks are paying attention to.
Any conversation about this topic has to begin with the remembrance of the fact that Donald Trump was indicted for criminally conspiring to overthrow a democratic election. That has never before happened in the United States. He didn't give up. He left power because all avenues had been exhausted, but he and his allies have now had 4 years to think of smarter ways to subvert the democratic process, which is why we see Tulsi Gabbard selectively releasing intelligence information to make Democrats look bad, why Bill Pulte, who is nothing more than a bagman and a henchman, has been put in her place there to continue the work, why Kash Patel's FBI is raiding election offices in swing states. None of this is normal. No satisfactory explanations have been given to the public for any of this. And people need to pay attention because there's another inconvenient fact that we don't talk about. Donald Trump didn't seize power in the 2024 election. He was elected. He was elected with the American people full well knowing he was willing to break the law to stay in power and that he was willing to abscond from the White House with classified documents, that he was willing to violate campaign finance laws in a fashion that got him convicted in New York, that he was credibly determined to have
drag is real. Keep going, Michael Feinberg. I'm like, damn, the American people, we failed. Keep going. The ones that voted for Trump did, not me. 92% strong.
We did. As a country, as a polity, we let this happen, which means that we cannot look to other people to fix it for us. No. We have to do the hard work of democratic mobilization, campaigning, protesting, speaking, and advocating. And on those last two counts, I'm really glad that those of us who made that choice months ago now have Jack Smith on our side.
Well, cooperation ends today. It is time for him to pay. Those rhyming lines were aimed at Donald Trump, and they are from one of the many people Donald Trump hates. Today, as every Republican in Congress, in the House, and in the Senate who is running for re-election cowers in fear of Donald Trump every single day of their lives, people who Donald Trump threatens, people who Donald Trump hates as much as he has ever hated anyone, continue to stand up to Donald Trump, and one of them is going to make him pay, and pay very soon. Former Special Prosecutor Jack Smith came to this network today to do the first interview he has ever done about his 2 federal criminal prosecutions of Donald Trump, did that interview with Nicole Wallace here at 5 p.m. Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to imprison Jack Smith, and Jack Smith, who told Congress in public testimony that he developed proof that Donald Trump is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, said today there is nothing Donald Trump can say or do to intimidate him.
I am not going to be intimidated. And there's no way in the world, if the thought was to go after me so that I wouldn't speak up about the corruption that's happening or speak up to defend these agents and prosecutors, that is a grave miscalculation. There is no way I'm going to be intimidated.
And E. Jean Carroll, who is now 82 years old and who has beaten Donald Trump in court repeatedly in 2 different cases, is now telling Donald Trump it is time to pay up. E. Jean Carroll's most recent crushing of Donald Trump in court came when the United States Supreme Court unanimously rejected Donald Trump's appeal of the $5 million judgment that a federal jury awarded to E. Jean Carroll 3 years ago after finding Donald Trump, as the New York Times put it, quote, liable for sexually abusing and defaming Ms. Carroll. In order to pursue his appeal, Donald Trump had to put the $5 million in an escrow account controlled by the judge in the case. Both sides of the case, Donald Trump's lawyers and E. Jean Carroll's lawyers, at the time agreed that the money would have to be paid as soon as Donald Trump got to the end of the line of his appeals, which is, of course, the denial of a petition for the Supreme Court to hear the case. And that happened on Monday. And immediately, according to E. Jean Carroll's lawyers, Donald Trump's lawyers called E. Jean Carroll's lawyers to ask for an extension on paying the money that Donald Trump now owes E. Jean Carroll in that case. Attorney Roberta Kaplan, who has successfully represented E. Jean Carroll in this case at every stage, told the judge in writing, quote, defendant's counsel contacted Carroll's undersigned counsel to inquire whether Carroll would consent to a further stay of enforcement of the judgment in this action so that defendant can ask the Supreme Court to reconsider its denial. And yeah, I'm kind of laughing about that because the Supreme Court just doesn't reconsider their denials. I mean, theoretically, technically, it's possible, but it's way, way, way less than a 1% chance. E. Jean Carroll's lawyer had a one-word answer for the Trump lawyers: no. And then she immediately filed a motion with the judge saying, quote, the court should enforce the plain language of the existing stipulation and order and direct immediate disbursement of funds, because the $5 million judgment gains interest every day that Donald Trump doesn't pay it, and it has been gaining that interest for 3 years now. The total that Donald Trump actually owes E. Jean Carroll as of Tuesday was $5,779,783, and it has gone up since then because it goes up every day that Donald Trump doesn't pay it. E. Jean Carroll's lawyer reminded the judge of all the delay tactics Donald Trump has used throughout this case over the years and quoted the judge himself as having said in the past that Donald Trump, quote, should not be permitted to run the clock out on a plaintiff's attempt to gain a remedy. E. Jean Carroll's lawyer ended her 9-page motion with these words, quote, to date, Carroll has agreed to each of defendants' many requests to delay the payment he owes her, given the extraordinary lengths he has taken to avoid such payments, and that each of those efforts has been denied in full. That cooperation ends today. It is time for him to pay. Carroll. The judge gave Donald Trump a deadline of next Tuesday, July 7th, to reply to that motion. It is at this point impossible to foresee any other outcome than the judge ordering Donald Trump to pay the now almost $5.8 million that he owes E. Jean Carroll within a matter of days, probably within this month of July. And so it's time's up for Donald Trump. Because E. Jean Carroll says it is. Time's up for Donald Trump because our judicial system was designed to allow a private citizen to have the same rights and powers in a courtroom that anyone else has, even if the other person in the case is currently the President of the United States. And that is why Donald Trump has tried to destroy that system. That is why Donald Trump has tried to poison the federal judiciary with incompetent federal judges like the one he appointed in Florida, whose place in history will be having disgraced herself by doing everything she possibly could to block Jack Smith's prosecution of Donald Trump for violations of the Espionage Act and the illegal possession of classified documents after Donald Trump left the presidency. That is why Donald Trump has poisoned the Justice Department by trying to fill it with people, including an FBI director, with no allegiance or expertise and no allegiance to anything or anyone other than Donald Trump. Donald Trump cannot survive in a federal criminal justice system that actually works. And so he's done everything he can to destroy it, not because of some political or philosophical belief, but entirely as a matter of self-protection. Protection from brave plaintiffs like E. Jean Carroll, who could not be intimidated by Donald Trump, and brave prosecutors like Jack Smith, who could not be intimidated by Donald Trump. Donald Trump can afford the $5.8 million that he owes E. Jean Carroll, and the federal judge handling the case knows that, because like all federal judges in New York City, he must read the New York Times, which has been delivering the best reporting on Donald Trump's profiting from the presidency.